It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative peer Ed Vaizey, Labour MP Barry Gardiner, environmental campaigner and Guardian columnist George Monbiot, and Talk TV international editor Isabel Oakeshott. Today, can Boris Johnson move on?
I want to start by saying that I'm humbled by what has happened, and I renew my wholehearted apology.
He's apologised belatedly when he was caught. He's not sorry that he did it, he's sorry that he was caught.
The government is trying to move on, with Rishi Sunak expected to announce a plan to cut hundreds of pounds from energy bills. Also today, should comedians be able to make jokes about anyone?
I deal in taboo subjects because I want to take the audience to a place that hasn't been before, even for a split second.
This is food grown in a laboratory. My guest George Monbiot thinks it will end farming. Is he right? And we'll discuss this. Campaigners letting down tyres on what they call gas guzzlers. Let's start with the fallout from the Sue Gray report yesterday, following her investigation into parties at Downing Street. Two contrasting front pages. Let's start with the Mirror. Partygate official report. While we were sacrificing and mourning, they were drinking until they were sick, laughing at security guards, laughing at cleaners, laughing at us all. This is how the Mail reports it. For months, the Prime Minister's enemies salivated at the prospect of Sue Gray skewering him. Yet after her report's innocuous photos of him with juice and M&S sandwiches, even they must be asking, is that it? Ed Vaizey, just to start, when you were on the show in January, which was around the time Sue Gray was commissioned and asked to carry out her report, you said that Boris Johnson was a great electoral and political asset. Do you think he still is?
Yes, I do. And I think he will survive this. And I think it feels, funny enough, as if people have already moved on from this. And I saw the famous cake photo, and I think it did reinforce the point, the slightly unfortunate phrase that Conor Burns used, that the Prime Minister was ambushed by a cake. As you know, I haven't been able to get worked up about this, and I think if there's going to be any time for reflection, it's about the draconian COVID rules that were imposed on all of us. So I think he will move on. And I think the other key point, and the reason why Tory MPs aren't moving against him on this, is it's a ruthless calculation. It hasn't shifted the polls. Keir Starmer is not making any kind of progress that I can see. The local elections were bad but that's what a governing party would expect. They were not catastrophic. Oh, right. Well, before I come back to other Tory MPs who don't agree with you, Barry, on that, is Boris Johnson an electoral asset for the Labour Party? The former Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell tweeting this morning a discredited Johnson staggering on is a gift to the Labour Party. Is that how you see it?
Well, it may well be the case, but I want to take issue with what Ed said, because, look, Ed, what Sue Gray came out with yesterday was that there was vomit on the carpets, there was wine thrown on the walls. Are we really saying that the Prime Minister didn't come down from the flat at any stage, see the rubbish? The cleaners were being treated disrespectfully. The security guards were being treated disrespectfully. I think that's something that the public will look at and say, what are you guys like? I agree with you that if there was anything new in the Sue Gray report that was genuinely shocking, it was the way that the staff were treated. And I think that is something that those responsible should be absolutely ashamed of. But if you want to know what I think about what happens in the real world, do I think the Prime Minister, first of all, it's quite clear from the evidence that when he attended these parties, he was not there carousing till 2 in the morning. And I very much doubt whether he goes into any other offices apart from the Cabinet Room and his own office, which is next door to it. He's the man in charge, and he said he took responsibility. It doesn't sound like responsibility to me if there are parties going on till 3 in the morning with people vomiting, people sitting on each other's laps in the room when he's there. That, you know, if you look at the number of empty bottles, wine bottles, that were on the table in some of those photos, I don't think he could have been under any illusions. But Leave
All
it
right.
there.
Well, George, Rishi Sunak, I'm being told, is just getting to his feet to announce this widely expected package, including things like a windfall tax. Do you agree with Rishi Sunak and the government? It is time to move on and talk about more important issues.
Well, no. I mean, the problem is that, we are stuck with this Prime Minister who has been clearly exposed as possessing not a gram of remorse, of shame, of common decency, who was laughing in the face of the country while the rest of the country was making major sacrifices. And people like Ed and his party have allowed this man to cling to power like a dag to a sheep's bottom, while we need to be desperately getting on with the serious stuff, but all the oxygen is being sucked up by this drama as this gigantic toddler in Downing Street is clinging to the furniture, refusing to be sent to bed. I mean, if they... never mind what's good for your party, because actually I couldn't give a stuff what's good for your party. If you had the interests of the country at heart, you would chuck this guy out straight away, so we could move on and focus on the serious
Very colourful
issues.
language, but let Ed answer.
Well, I mean, I became involved in this, as it were. I mean, first of all, I can't get rid of Boris Johnson, but I'm not an MP, so I can't put a letter in for a start. And secondly, it's what I genuinely think about Partygate, as it were. It wouldn't matter whether it was Boris Johnson or indeed another Prime Minister. I didn't climb on a bandwagon. I didn't climb on a bandwagon to say that Keir Starmer drinking beer with his Labour colleagues in Durham was also a problem. So that was my view. It was based on what I thought the risk was, the fact they all worked together, and I didn't see why adding a cake to
see here. That's
what
you're saying.
There may be plenty of issues that the government should be held to account over. I do not believe that this would be a resigning issue.
All right, Isabel, let me just
That's my genuine view.
Let me just put to Isabel one of the things that Ed did say, which is there hasn't been an exodus so far, if that's the right word, of Conservative MPs or Tory MPs putting in letters of no confidence, except, of course, there have been 3 new additions. Let's just show you this from my colleague Nick Eardley. Another Conservative MP, John Barron, withdraws support for the Prime Minister. His repeated assurances in Parliament that there was no rule-breaking is simply not credible. Julian Sturdy is another one, and David Simmons. But so far, could it be a drip-drip effect on the Prime Minister?
It looks very much as if the Prime Minister is here to stay until the next election, and on the shoulders of every Tory MP who's been complicit in that, be it. I think they will pay a great political price for that at the next election. And Ed, I am genuinely bewildered by your response to this. Do you have children?
Yes.
So if your children are having repeated parties downstairs in the house and you happen to be upstairs in the study, do you say that's nothing to do with me? I have no idea what's going on because I was upstairs in the study. And do you say, never mind, kids, leave the mess, I'll clear it up in the morning, nothing to see here?
Of course, just to interject, the Met Police only fined Boris Johnson for one event, just to remind people, and no further fines were made. Ed?
Well, as I say, I mean, I'm not doing this because I think that Boris Johnson should be Prime Minister. And I take your point, Isabel, that the Tories may well pay a very heavy political price at the next election. My observation, almost like a political observer, is that I don't think they seem to be paying that price in the polls. I think Tory MPs would move against Boris Johnson if Keir Starmer was 20 or 30 points ahead in the polls.
His personal ratings are at their lowest ever, aren't they, at the moment?
Yeah, but
so we'll see. We've got a couple of pretty pivotal by-elections coming up.
You may well be proved right, Isabel. You may well be able to say to Tory MPs in June 23, June 24, I told you so, you should have got rid of this guy. I personally don't think it's a resigning offence.
Wow.
But as an objective point,
what about misleading Parliament?
I don't think they will get rid of him on the basis of what the polls...
All right, we're going to move on because we've got so much to talk about on the programme today, including what Rishi Sunak is announcing. We haven't had time yet to bring you a clip from what he's saying in the Commons, but I can show you this headline, which is energy bills to be cut by hundreds as part of £10 billion support package. We're expecting a windfall tax after weeks of raging within the Cabinet about whether they should or shouldn't do it, but also turning the £200 loan that every family was going to get the chance to take into a £400 grant or cheque in the post. Is it right that it's not more targeted and everyone is going to get this £400?
Well, it reminds me, as it were, of the stimulus cheques that the US government sent out, and there will be, to put it in very sort of crude terms, a cost-benefit analysis that it could well be easier simply to give everyone this relief in order to reduce the administration costs and also to get the money out quickly rather than targeting. Having said that, potentially it could be linked to things like the winter fuel allowance or indeed universal credit. But that is clearly a calculation that they've taken, that it's just simpler to give the grant to everyone.
But do you think it's right? Should it be more targeted?
Well, as I say, I think it's not I'm not taking a sort of moral position on this. I think they're taking a very pragmatic view about what is the best way to get out support, and it will hit the people who need the money the most.
It's a moral issue, isn't it? If in the 5th richest country in the world we have, 2 million people who are going without food for more than 24 hours, who can't feed their children, who can't heat their homes, that is a moral issue. You can't say, well, I'm not taking a moral position on it. That is a moral position.
Yeah, but hang on, what are you saying here, Barry? That it should be more targeted? Because the windfall tax wasn't targeted necessarily in that
sense. It should be more targeted. We should be, and whether you do it through the restoring the £20 cut on universal credit, whether you do it through the winter fuel allowance, but of course it should be targeted. It should be targeted at those who are in greatest need.
But I presume you welcome it, that the windfall tax is probably just about to be announced.
I couldn't sleep all last night. The screeching from number 11 Downing Street on that U-turn, I heard all the way to Wembley.
Right decision, Isabel, on that, the screeching U-turn.
Obviously, they had to do something. I find the timing of this cynical at absolute best. I mean, coming out with this stuff, you know, just as the Prime Minister faces one of his roughest days, I think is hardly going to enhance people's view of politics and politicians. And I think that the amounts, we don't know the detail yet of the package, but the amounts, the headline figures may sound impressive, billions, but let's remember just how much people are facing simply on their energy bills. By the autumn will have gone up by £1,500. In order for that, you have to earn about £2,000. So if you're getting a couple of £100 back, and we're not even taking into account here the fuel rises and the food and everything else, these are pretty small amounts, actually.
Are you saying it should all be covered?
I'm saying that there should be a lot more generous help than that, and the government could pay for it by efficiency savings.
Rishi Sunak is just talking about the profits made by oil and gas companies. Presumably, George, you're in favour of a windfall tax on those companies.
Yeah, he's finally come round to it. But, you know, at the same time, you know, we should be insisting that those companies make that transition to renewables. And
they would argue that they are supposedly making the investment.
I'm saying so slow.
Well.
But also, what's missing from this discussion is the Tories' disastrous record on insulating homes.
Yes.
You know, where you can both help people in fuel poverty and help protect the planet from global heating.
How long does it take to retrofit homes of sort of old housing stock, Edwardian, Victorian houses?
I mean, it was going at a tremendous pace before the Tories came into power, and then they nixed the government programme, and it just fell off a cliff. It declined by 97%.
It's actually pretty difficult on older houses. And I looked into it for my house, and it was basically going to be tens of thousands. I mean, and a huge structural changes. So.
I mean, but this is actually even then. I mean, your house is probably much more expensive than the average in terms of the need for it. But even then, you know, if you look at what Italy's doing, it's giving people these grants of €110,000 to do their houses up.
In that case, I'm in.
Oh, well, there you go. You've got one more person signed up.
Can I just...
Targeted help.
Pick one other aspect of this. For weeks, we've had the government saying, no, these companies, these big oil and gas companies, they need this money to make investments to transition to renewables. The fact of the matter is that the Chancellor last year gave them 130% super tax deductible on their research and development. So all the development, all those investments that they were talking about, they were going to get back 100% of those investments and then 30% on top. So they didn't need that money, those billions in excess profits that they made, to make the investment, because actually you and me as taxpayer are already going to pay for that development, and we still are, because Rishi Sunak refuses to put a green filter on the super tax deductibles. And that's the tragedy of this.
Right. Isabel says you could pay for a lot of this help through efficiencies. Do you agree with that?
Efficiencies are great when you're in opposition, right?
Well, that's very candid of you.
It's a good point.
We all love to say that we could make efficiencies. We all find it very difficult in government to do it.
I think when you're spending £1 trillion, then it's fairly easy to save a few quid.
I'm sure you could.
Anything else that the government should be looking at? Now they've decided to take the plunge.
I mean, I remember years ago when I was still in opposition, sitting on a committee that called for solar panels to be fitted on all new homes, and that was nixed. Again, so that we didn't slow down the house building programme. And when I was the telecoms minister, I wanted to put superfast broadband into every new development. That was also nixed. Now, that doesn't sound like a green measure, but actually if you give people gigabit broadband, you might stop people, a lot more people can potentially work from home, or you could have local businesses and rural businesses. So all of those things are stopped in the kind of drive to build more houses. I certainly think that I've never quite understood what happened with the feed-in tariff, which made solar panels much more expensive. But having said that, of course, and it did start with the Labour government, but the government has been very successful in terms of the transition to renewables. We don't use coal as, the use of coal has dramatically fallen off. I had a power station in my constituency, a coal-fired power station. All 6 chimneys have now been demolished. That station is no longer in use. So Britain is one of the leaders, and the creation of the offshore wind turbine industry as well.
Britain has done the easy things first, because actually
most countries
it doesn't make much difference to anybody where your electricity is coming from when you turn on the lights. But all the more difficult stuff is stuff that we need to be involved in, which is having our homes insulated, having our boilers changed,
which is expensive,
changing our transport policies and the rest of it. And the government has completely failed to engage with those things. And as a result, it's dumped all that on individual people to try to sort out for themselves. And we can't afford to do that. As individuals, we can't afford it. The government can afford that and can actually, stimulate
I do
whole
agree.
new.
Some of these green schemes that they've come up with were, and I looked at them rather like Isabel and I were living in parallel worlds. There's something to do with double glazing or something. Unbelievably complicated, and you had to get X thing first before you qualified for a double glazing grant and so on. They could make it much simpler, and they could be frankly, much more entrepreneurial about it in terms of engaging with people about how easy some of these things potentially could be. I don't know, because the government won't tell me.
Well, I promised we'd hear from Rishi Sunak. Here he is.
As ever, there is a sensible middle ground. We should not be ideological about this, we should be pragmatic. It is possible to both tax extraordinary profits fairly and incentivise investment. And so, like previous governments, including Conservative ones, we will introduce a temporary targeted energy profits levy, but we have built into the new levy a new investment allowance similar to the super deduction.
Busy 36 hours for the government in the chamber. Isabel, do you think the government will get credit, if that's the right word, for introducing this package of measures? Because certainly the Conservative MPs sitting in Ed's seat over the last few weeks don't feel they got the credit for what they say was a £22 billion package of measures to help.
No, I don't think they will get the credit, because I don't think people are going to be feeling materially anything other than worse off for a very long time. And Boris's new catchphrase seems to be in Parliament now to talk about Labour's lust for tax rises. And I have to say that really sticks in the throat when you consider that the Conservative government has imposed the highest tax burden for decades. And I just don't think that with these measures people are going to be feeling much better off.
All right, we're going to talk about something completely different. The comedian Ricky Gervais has a new show, a new special on Netflix. We can't show it on daytime television, but let's have a look at some of the reaction to it. Here's one headline in The Guardian. Ricky Gervais' Netflix special condemned by LGBTQ groups for anti-trans rants masquerading as jokes. Well, this week he appeared on The One Show. He was asked about it, and here's what he had to say.
I deal in taboo subjects because I want to take the audience to a place that hasn't been before, even for a split second. And, most offence comes from when people mistake the subject of a joke with the actual target. So it starts, they go, what's he going to say? I tell the joke, phew, they laugh. It's like a parachute jump. It's scary, but then you land, and it's all OK. And I think that's what comedy is for, getting us over taboo subjects. They're not scary anymore.
You were laughing there, Ed. Should he be able to make jokes about whomever he wants?
Yeah, absolutely. I saw him on Piers Morgan's show. Your channel, Isabel. I've just realised I've plugged your channel there.
Thank you.
Get back in your
Well, that's enough. Yes, that's enough, yeah.
After Partygate. And I thought it was interesting seeing the two people kind of debating that issue. I gather that, one of the comedians, a gay comedian, was very, very supportive of Ricky Gervais. He's had support from trans activists on Twitter, I gather. I think he's absolutely right. I don't think there are taboo subjects. You can obviously be grotesquely offensive, gratuitously, and try and persuade people that's a joke. That's not something I would support. But I watched Ricky Gervais's jokes, and they're near the knuckle, but they're not something I would want to cancel or ban or indeed that I thought would be offensive.
George, you agree, or are certain groups of people off limits? One critic, also a comedian, James Acaster, has accused Ricky Gervais of what is called punching down jokes aimed at minorities, marginalised groups.
So, I mean, the first thing to say is Ricky Gervais is a bona fide comic genius. I mean, I don't know if you've seen Afterlife. It gets you in the ribs, it gets you in the heart. It's a brilliant, brilliant series. He doesn't need to humiliate people to be funny. And I'm not saying I want to cancel him or anything like that. I'm just saying he can do it without punching down. He can be utterly brilliant and kill you with laughter without having to add to this whole burden of sadness and humiliation and anger and conflict, of which we just have too much at the moment.
Except in his defence, someone said, but if it's funny, it's fine.
I just think that's a bit wet, George. Sorry. I mean, nobody has to listen to Ricky Gervais. If you don't like it, switch it off.
Yeah,
you know,
well,
I think sometimes poking fun at things is the best way to normalise them. And why do we have categories of people that it's OK to poke fun at, but categories of people that it isn't? If you don't like it, don't listen.
Look, these are matters of taste. You know, I'm not saying anyone should be banned or cancelled for this at all. I'm just saying I prefer the Ricky Gervais I see in Afterlife to the Ricky Gervais making jokes like this. And, you know, in a world where there's so much misery now, you know, let's aim for the humour.
People can decide not to be offended the whole time. It's so boring. Always being offended.
It's not really even about offence. Let's not pile on the humiliation and the misery.
It's supposed to be about comedy, though, and the idea is, Barry, is anyone or any group off limits for a comedian?
No, I don't think anybody should be off limits for a comedian, but I do think it's important, and it's very difficult in comedy, but it is important to be kind. And comedy is very often you have a butt of a joke. I think it's very difficult to think of comedy as not punching, whether it's down or up, but actually comedy depends on that unkindness to a certain extent. And I do think that if you're ridiculing people, we have laws that you can't incite to violence and hatred and so on. But comedy should never go there. But there's always that grit in comedy, which to me has that sense of unkindness. Now, I don't know whether that makes me wet, Isabel, or whether it's dry. Maybe I finally want to do what Rishi Sunak was talking about and be somewhere in the middle.
I suppose it's the difference between teasing and being nasty,
yes,
isn't it?
That's a really good. That's a really good.
It's a fine line. I mean, it's never totally clear which side of that line you are, but it's you know, he's got so much range, so much scope. He can be so funny without being concerned about crossing that line, so just don't go there. I mean,
right. Well, don't go there. Do you think...
Well, I think there are cultural guardrails which are sort of unspoken. So, for example, a Jewish comedian making jokes about the Jewish community is fine. A non-Jewish comedian making jokes about the Jewish community can easily be misinterpreted. But the guardrails don't exist if a male comedian makes jokes about women, or indeed a woman comedian makes jokes about men. So there are, I think, unspoken guardrails about where comedians can and can go without fear of being sort of contradicted or misinterpreted, if I can put it that way, or but in effect by getting permission from the audience to tell those jokes.
Yes, getting permission is an interesting concept, isn't it? Do you agree with those sorts of guardrails, as Ed calls them?
Well, I think that's right. There are guardrails, and the permission is this: you switch on your television. That's the permission. You switch on. You decide, I want to watch this, and that is also a guardrail for the audience. Now, it doesn't mean that once you've switched on your television, you should be subject to all sorts of nastiness and vitriol because you've decided to watch a programme. No, that's not acceptable. But actually, if you do switch on, knowing that it's a comedian who's likely to make jokes which are on the edge, and I mean, if you think of some of the great comedians, the satirists over the years, they have always raised huge social issues, and they've done it in a way that very often has normalised and moved things on.
Well, that's sort of what Ricky Gervais has said in other parts of the interview in response to this, interestingly. I mean, his metaphor that we showed there at the beginning, that I'm there to shock to some extent until it's a bit more normalised. I mean, Barry obviously buys that in principle to some extent. Do you? Is that what it's about? That there is nicer comedy and then there's shocking comedy?
Well, ultimately, it's about making people laugh. And if people don't find it funny, I mean, he's not there to provide some kind of, you know, cultural service or... it's a gig,
he gets. Yes, all right, maybe I was too lofty there. All right, I take your point, fair enough. Let me just give you some reaction to what Rishi Sunak has been announcing. This is from Martin Lewis, the money-saving expert. 1/3 of all UK households will receive one or more of the payments. He's worked it out at £650 for those on benefits, £300 extra for pensioners and £150 on top for those on non-means-tested disabilities. Make a difference, Barry?
Yes, and I'm really pleased to see that actually there is targeting here. So I think that's excellent. I'm pleased about that.
All right, we're going
to... I've gone through the process in 3 minutes that every Tory MP goes through of defending a policy which is then U-turned, although, of course, I was defending a policy I knew nothing about, to discover that it is indeed targeted and now has Barry's approval.
Well, thanks for that disclaimer there in the programme. We're going to talk about farming because, George, you've written a new book. It's called Regenesis, Feeding the World Without Devouring the Planet. In it, you say farming is the most destructive human activity ever to have blighted the earth. Is it really that bad, George?
It is. It's the biggest cause of habitat destruction, biggest cause of species loss, biggest cause of extinction, biggest cause of soil loss, one of the biggest causes of water pollution, air pollution, climate breakdown. I mean, you know, we need it, but we have to recognise what it's doing to us.
Well, let's welcome Abby Reader, because she is a farmer, Deputy President of the Welsh branch of the National Farmers Union. Listening to that, Abby, what do you make of George's argument?
Well, good afternoon. Look, it's not really a landscape that I recognise. When I look at UK agriculture, I see green rolling fields protecting rural communities that have helped to feed us for generations, and providing all sorts of protection for biodiversity and the environment. Now, George has said that there is always going to be a compromise because we are using land to feed ourselves that could otherwise be used to run wild, but that is life.
Well, so good to talk to Abby. The first thing to say is, look, we should minimise our land footprint and we should minimise all the impacts that we make in feeding ourselves. And now we have a lot of really exciting new techniques for doing that. New ways of growing grain, new ways of producing fruit and veg, and completely new ways of producing the protein we eat, which don't require animal farming at all. And that would enable us to take very large areas of the land out of production, rewild it, stop the sixth great extinction in its tracks, draw down vast amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and possibly save our life support systems from collapsing. Isn't that a worthy aim?
Abby?
Yeah, so I think where you and I differ, George, is as a farmer, I look at the food system in its entirety. So I'm not just looking at one aspect like carbon or food or biodiversity. We're doing all of those things together. And we need to think now about the UK, not globally, because we can't speak for other countries. But we are managing to do these things. We are improving with the technology and making sure that we're getting more from less because we know we've got to feed a growing population. We are learning from mistakes that might have been made in the past from new technology. And I just think that the way you look at the world is far too polarised, and it seems to be just focused on carbon and the environment, and it's forgetting people who are living in this environment, whether they're myself and others who are in rural communities as farmers and the food chain, or whether they are consumers generally who are relying on us.
Well, you can't have read the book because looking at the system as a whole is exactly what it does. And what I've been trying to do is to see where this system is heading. And it's not in a great place at all. In fact, the global food system is beginning to look rather like the global financial system in the run-up to 2008. It's got a lot of structural instabilities which are now being revealed by the crisis in Ukraine, but they were there beforehand. And people have been getting hungrier since 2015, even without the crisis in Ukraine and without the pandemic. And that's because there are some really fundamental loss of resilience within this system. We need to change things drastically. We need to diversify and change the way we produce our food. We need to farm as if there will be a tomorrow, because if we don't, there will not be.
All right, well, let's go back to the land itself. Abby, we're showing pictures of your farm and your cattle. Tell us what we can see. It's in Glamorganshire.
Yep, so you are seeing, I believe, a video of my dairy cows being turned out after the winter. They're grateful to be back out on the grass,
yes,
running around. Those cows are dated back to both sets of grandparents, descended from them. And they have been feeding the nation all through COVID. They're helping to feed the nation now as we get through the Ukrainian war. They're contributing to our environment. They are part of who and what we are here in the UK. We're a maritime country. We're growing grass. We're converting it into protein that is meat and dairy. And I'm very proud to say that that is found in over 98% of households here in the UK.
I'm going to open this. Oh, sorry, go on. Finish your point. Yes, sorry.
Well, sorry, I was just going to come to the point. My apologies, George. I haven't read your book. But I understand that it's looking at factory meat. So something that's grown in a petri dish. And
no, it's not actually.
I'm not going to say that may not come in the future, but it's not here now. What's here now is people like me feeding you.
We're going to come on to the process that you were talking about, George, and you'll have a chance to talk about it. But just quickly, before I do open it up, George, looking at those dairy cows, are you saying that we're going to have to get rid of that farm, those animals, to do what you say is necessary?
So I've spent a day on Abby's farm, and it's a beautiful place, and Abby's a great person. But this is a fantastically inefficient way of producing our food. So worldwide, 28% of the surface of the planet is grazing land, like Abby's farm. It produces 1% of our protein. I mean, that is a really profligate land use. I mean, all the crops on Earth only occupy 12% of the land. 28% given over to grazing. And all that is land which would otherwise be hosting forests and wetlands and savannas, places which people like Abby could be paid to restore, because almost all people keeping animals outdoors are totally dependent on farm subsidies. We should be changing those subsidies and paying for ecological restoration rather than continued destruction.
I'm going to come back to you, Abby, in just a moment, but let me get the others in. Isabel, you think intensive farming is broken, but would you go as far as the sort of scenario that we've just heard there from George?
Well, it was lovely to see those cows going out into the pasture, and that is how farm animals should be reared. Unfortunately, in many countries, that is an absolute minority system. We now have mega dairies and beef cattle reared on feedlots where they never see the light of day. I mean, there's a farm in Saudi Arabia with 100,000 cows who are all kept indoors in the desert. This is a grotesque way of making milk. It's a grotesque way of making meat, you know, and we don't actually see many chickens outdoors. We've got some free range, but the reality is that the vast majority of our meat and dairy is produced in an industrial way, with those animals not out on pasture. And this is the great contributor to climate change that our politicians have not been brave enough to confront. The figures are extraordinary. 14% of man-made carbon emissions are from industrial livestock farming. If it were a country, it would be the second greatest carbon emitter. So politicians have got to get braver about this. The system isn't actually working in any way as well as people perceive it, because their meat is quite cheap, artificially so.
In terms of the vision, Ed, would you like to see Abby's farm stay exactly as it is, or do you think there's an inevitability about what George is saying and Isabel too?
Well, I was thinking, as the ticker tape ran across the screen, about sheep. You know, that sheep are part of our landscape, as it were, our bucolic English landscape. But I have a lot of sympathy for George's thesis, and I haven't read the book either, because George, you know, didn't send me a copy.
Only published today. I think it would have been a tall order for any of us to have read it.
You were very harsh on poor Abby.
Yes, well, it was all of us, but yeah.
I have a lot of sympathy, and there are 2 points I would add. One is the investment community. I mean, there's a ruthless capitalist called Carl Icahn who's decided to take on McDonald's because of getting pork from pigs who are kept in pens and not allowed to roam around. So I think the investment community, which is very hot on climate change and ESG, should be encouraged to look at food processing. And the second thing is, this is another area where the government, the UK government, could be hugely entrepreneurial and lean in. The agri-tech sector, as it were, as part of the tech sector, is very exciting, from vertical farming in cities through to growing meat subsidies from, in laboratories. So it's a huge potential opportunity. That's what I've always thought, for example, about the climate change debate. It's a win-win if the UK can get ahead in this technology, which is going to be vital in terms of how we feed ourselves in the future.
Not a big farming community in Brent, in your constituency necessarily, Barry, but what about rural communities? Like the one where Abby lives, and rural England. I mean, are you up for changing that completely?
Well, look, I think agriculture, in a global sense, is at a crossroads now. And it's tending to go down the route that Isabel was talking about, into intensification. I think that's absolutely the wrong route to go. And we cannot stay as we are with the global population as it is and the pressures of global warming. Because what's happening, in fact, is to achieve the meat consumption that people are wanting, we're seeing the deforestation in the Amazon and other parts of the world that are driving climate change. So this is a crossroads, and we will have to go either to intensification in the way that Isabel and I would loathe to go down, or to find a way through that George is suggesting. And I want to pay tribute to British farmers. I think they've done a fantastic job. If you look at the change since the Second World War and what the farming community have done, they've responded, they've tried to work with that. But all the things that George said, the overuse of fertiliser, the eutrophication of our rivers, all of the pollution that has come from farming and modern farming practices has been hugely destructive. We have to find a better way, because we're too many people on this planet to do anything else other than find a sustainable future.
George, I'm just going to interrupt and Abby show some pictures of the process that you and George both talked about. This is about bacteria farming and your experience, George, you've written about of eating a bacteria pancake. Right, this is one company producing this type of product. Solar Foods is a Finnish food tech startup. It produces Soline. You can see there it's been made into, using air and electricity, ice cream. Spencer Kelly, the BBC presenter there, is trying it. Is it yummy, George?
Yeah, I mean, so the pancake I ate, a small flip for man, tasted exactly like a pancake. We had to dilute it with wheat flour because the bacterial flour is about 60% protein, so we would have made an omelette, and it came out just like a blinking pancake. It's quite amazing. But the thing is, with this completely new source of protein and fat and the rest of it, we could develop an entire new range of foods. I mean, not just substituting the meat and stuff that we eat.
Right, OK, so things we'd never heard of.
Exactly. Just as the first farmers to domesticate a wild cow were never thinking of camembert, right? We can't even conceive of what could come out at the end of this. And I think it's really exciting because it absolutely minimises the footprint of food production, allows us to give back huge amounts of land to nature, could actually be the decisive factor that gets us through this century.
Right, well, interesting. What would you prefer to eat? Beef, Ed, from Abby's cow, they're dairy cows, but
dairy,
yes, thank you for the correction. Beef or some of that nice ice cream?
Well, I mean, that sort of puts the problem in perspective as well. I mean, I think George's thesis will land quite well, actually, with quite a lot of Tories. Yeah. Tories are very passionate about animal welfare, for example, and you've got people like Zach Goldsmith. But there may come crashing into, as it were, the hair-shirt critique of anything that involves climate, which is, I want to carry on eating beef, not this kind of
But guess what? You can do, because there's also cellular meat, which is coming, and that is now possible to produce at scale. What we don't have in this country is the regulatory framework.
Exactly, and that's why
so these are still considered novel foods.
We haven't got very long left, and I want to get Abby in again before the end of the programme. Abby, George said a little bit earlier that you could be paid to do a different kind of job on the land. How do you feel about that?
Well, I'll just very quickly start by making a plea on behalf of Welsh farmers and behalf of British farmers. When we're talking about all of these issues, can we please look at British figures, not global figures? We are a very sustainable farming system here in the UK, and we should be proud of it. I think in terms of George's suggestion that we could move to factory meats. Personally, I'm not very keen to be eating something like that at the moment. I don't think there is anywhere near enough research yet to say that is safe to be going into the human body. If it is, and we find that is in time, we're still not dealing with the now problem, which is we have to feed people today and tomorrow to get through all of these problems. And that is what we're doing. And if we have to do that, then as a farming industry, what we are doing is taking responsibility for reducing our emissions, for continuing to produce healthier food and to make it a lot more environmentally friendly. And that's what we're about.
Abby Reader, thank you very much. We haven't got time, unfortunately, because we're going to quickly talk about tyre extinguishers. We'll show you some of the pictures. This is a group of climate activists in the UK who go to well-off areas at night and let down the tyres of 4x4s. Apparently, only this morning, they've claimed they've let down the tyres of 100 4x4s in Edinburgh. Is this justifiable, Ed?
Well, no, I don't think it is. I mean, I think people gluing themselves to the road and deciding that they are going to be our spokesman on climate change and therefore have permission to interfere and mess up our lives in any way they see fit is unacceptable.
Yeah, but if you guys were doing your job, none of this would be necessary.
Well, vote for somebody else then. Don't let down people's tyres.
Yeah, here we are in the midst... Yeah, I do, actually. Well, here we are in the midst of a climate emergency.
Oh, come on,
you guys...
George.
What, you're saying it's not a climate emergency?
Of course there's a climate emergency, but
are you saying that's justifiable?
You're saying that just spouting the word climate emergency doesn't give you permission to vandalise people's cars or glue yourself to the pavement.
You haven't even let me finish my sentence.
I know, that's because you're talking nonsense.
You don't even know what I'm talking because I haven't said it yet.
Well, say it quick.
In the midst of a climate emergency, you guys are messing about, dragging us all into this ridiculous drama in Downing Street and not doing the job which needs to be done. So, what do we see? We look around us and see, oh my God, these people are trashing our life support systems with their SUVs and lots of other profoundly antisocial habits. So, yeah, I'm in favour of it because I think, actually, if you guys aren't going to regulate it, who's going to step in instead?
You're in favour of tyre letting down. Just to be clear, you literally are.
I am literally in favour.
Wow.
That might
I'm
let
in
you
favour.
Down. You've let me down. You let the whole school down.
Oh, right. Well, hang on.
I'm in favour of much cheaper electric cars. I'd love an electric car.
But not letting people's tyres down.
I've already had the front of my car taken off by vandals, the VW sign, so, you know.
Justifiable or not?
I think it's criminal damage, but I think there is a place for protest that disrupts lives, and
including letting down people's
no,
you said that's criminal damage. Yep.
Because I think you have to target your message to people who are going to be able to do something about it. And actually, the SUV drivers or owners of those cars are probably not the people who are going to be making the legislation.
OK, let's get some perspective here. SUVs not only are massively more damaging in terms of pollution and in terms of climate breakdown, shortening the lives of very many people. They're also far more dangerous for pedestrians and cyclists because they're so big and heavy. If you get hit by one, you're more likely to be killed.
I'm not advocating SUVs, George.
OK, but
I agree with you about SUVs.
By contrast to the extraordinary imposition they are making on us, letting down a few tyres is actually a very small imposition on them.
But 100, actually,
George,
this morning in
I think
Edinburgh.
you should withdraw your support for letting down tyres.
Yes.
I think that's really irresponsible for you to sit here on TV and say it's OK for people to take that type of direct action.
It's OK.
Wow.
All right, well, he's not, but he's not going to retract it for now.
I think direct action should be better targeted at the people who can actually achieve the change that we need and regulate the vehicle consumption.
In the meantime,
that we have.
People are not achieving this change, when we have a desire... Well,
I mean,
are you still a Conservative, or has that changed since the beginning of the programme?
This is why it goes back to this kind of hair shirt mentality, which is that, you know, now we'll get into a debate about, you know, how are George's books transported to their bookstores and so on and so forth.
Not in an SUV, I don't suppose.
Probably by an articulated lorry.
Right.
But if you've got a problem with SUVs, get Barry, when he's in power, to ban SUVs, which he's just effectively pledged to do, and pass the legislation to ban SUVs.
Don't make my election pledges for me. I'm very capable of making my own.
Don't let down the tyres of someone who may be taking their kids to school the next morning and has their
interesting and fascinating
ruined.
though this is, I'm just going to read a couple of lines from Rishi Sunak. He has announced that the government will introduce a temporary levy on the profits of oil and gas companies, the windfall tax, at a rate of 25% because of the extraordinary profits that they have been making. That's all we have time for from all of us. Have a very good afternoon, and I'll be back with Politics UK tomorrow. Bye-bye.